The first book that we're covering in our mysticism series is the famous spiritual classic, The Cloud of Unknowing. Now, this book was written in the 14th century by an unknown author who also wrote a few other famous spiritual works, such as the book on privy counseling and the Epistle of Stirrings. Now, this book was written in the Middle English style of literature, which means it has a lot of thee, thy, thou, and thine in it. So unless you're familiar with this style, then you might want to pick up a copy like this one, which has it translated into modern English and is a lot easier to absorb. Now, not much is known about this author other than the fact that his works were incredibly popular in Europe during his time, and that his works influenced many other mystics who came after him, such as St. John of the Cross. This author possessed an incredible amount of literary talent and had a way of describing the contemplative life that no other mystics seem to quite have captured in the same way. And if you don't know anything about this book yet, then the best way I can describe it is that this book is really kind of like the handbook on contemplative prayer. To say that this book radically changed my prayer life would not be saying enough. This book really is a literary masterpiece that takes you right into the heart of what contemplative prayer truly is. And it's the kind of book that you're going to come back to again and again over the years. And in true mystic fashion, the author of this book really urges the reader towards going for a direct inner experience of God rather than just knowledge about God. In the closing sentences of the book, he writes, "And so I urge you, go after experience rather than knowledge. On account of pride, knowledge may often deceive you, but this gentle, loving affection will not deceive you. Knowledge tends to breed deceit, but love builds. Knowledge is full of labor, but love full of rest." Now, while there have been many mystics who've taught about meditation, there have been very few who have taught on the contemplative prayer style of meditation that this book so eloquently describes. And one of the things I aim to do in this series is to show you that while fundamentalism differs dramatically across all the world religions, there truly is only one type of mysticism. And mystics from any religious persuasion can all sit together at the same table in perfect harmony. And that is because fundamentalism is an affair of the mind, and every human mind is different. But mysticism is an affair of the heart, and every human heart is the same. So I believe it is very beneficial for you to be able to see the same threads of truth being spoken across every mystical tradition around the world, whether that is Christian or Buddhist or Sufi, Hindu, or Jewish mysticism. Christ is bigger than any religion, including Christianity. And so, as the mystics often say, until you can see Christ in everything, then you do not truly see the Christ yet in anything. True contemplative prayer is one of the most powerful gateways for expanding your consciousness. And so in this episode, I'm going to give you 3 of my favorite golden nuggets of wisdom from this book. And at the end of the video, I'm also going to give you a very powerful new model for prayer that can truly change your life. And I really do mean that. So without further ado, let's dive into one of the most epic spiritual classics of all time, The Cloud of Unknowing. Welcome back to Moving Backwards, episode 14. So the first nugget of wisdom that I want to share with you from this book is the way that the author describes the most critical part of any meditation or contemplation, which is, of course, the loss of self. True contemplation can only begin once all thoughts and images of the mind have been cast aside. Because if you're in a contemplative prayer and you're busy thinking thoughts, even thoughts about God, then you're actually only contemplating your own thoughts about God, but not God himself. And so the way that the author brilliantly describes how to do this is through the visual of being caught between 2 clouds, the cloud of forgetting below you and the cloud of unknowing above you. Now, this author is as radical as any Zen master in his rejection of conceptualization. And he teaches that in order to truly taste the majesty of God's infinite being, then every thought, every image, and every concept you have must be buried beneath you in that cloud of forgetting. In chapter 3, he writes, And so diligently persevere until you feel joy in it. For in the beginning it is usual to feel nothing but a kind of darkness about your mind, or as it were, a cloud of unknowing. You will seem to know nothing and to feel nothing except a naked intent toward God in the depths of your being. Try as you might, this darkness and this cloud will remain between you and your God. You will feel frustrated, for your mind will be unable to grasp Him. But learn to be at home in this darkness. Return to it as often as you can, letting your spirit cry out to Him whom you love. For if in this life you hope to feel and see God as He is in Himself, it must be within this darkness and this cloud. But if you strive to fix your love on Him, forgetting all else, which is the work of contemplation I have urged you to begin, I am confident that God in His goodness will bring you to a deep experience of Himself. In other words, during this work, you must reject any thought that appears in your mind, whether good or bad. As the author states in this book, even good thoughts about God's nature ultimately serve as distractions during contemplative prayer, for the simple fact that thoughts about God are not God Himself. And this is something that religion cannot seem to understand. And so the cloud of unknowing represents the infinite vastness and mystery of God's eternal nature, which no thought or image could ever apprehend. The only thing that can penetrate into this cloud, as the author writes, is love itself. But what stands in the way of our love is the conditioned mind, or as we like to call it, the ego. And the author goes into great detail about the necessity of transcending the ego if you truly wish to venture into this cloud of unknowing during your contemplative work. And so the author describes in very Zen-like fashion the importance of making the self as nothing in the practice of God contemplation. In chapter 43, he writes, "And so reject the thought and experience of all created things, but most especially learn to forget yourself. For all your knowledge and experience depends upon the knowledge and feeling of yourself. All else is easily forgotten in comparison with one's own self. See if experience does not prove me right. Long after you have successfully forgotten every creature and its works, you will find that a naked knowing and feeling of your own being still remains between you and your God. And believe me, you will not be perfect in love until this too is destroyed." One of the sort of hallmarks of Christian mysticism is the insistence of the mystics on the importance of dying to the false self, just as Christ demands us to do in order to be His disciple. And now everybody wants to claim they're a disciple of Jesus, but very few people want to actually die to their ego, because this requires that you actually face your own arrogance, insecurity, and fear. And so the concept of ego death is something that the Western religious mind typically either rejects through arrogance or overlooks through ignorance. Because as the author stated in that passage we just read, the blissful union that results from transcending the ego is a truth that can only be verified by direct experience. The second remarkable thing about this book is that in a world long before quantum mechanics came around, this author seemed to have a genuine understanding about the quantum field, which he calls the place of nowhere. In the Hindu tradition, this field is called the void. This is the place of no location, no time, and no distance, just infinite possibility. It is that place of complete and total emptiness of mind or loss of self that can be accessed in consciousness during meditation. Physicists have explained only recently that there are actually no particles in the universe, but only one infinite field which ripples in unique ways to give the illusion of real matter appearing in time and space. But as quantum mechanics tells us, there is actually only the quantum field, which appears as nothing when it is not being observed. But in actuality, the entire material universe manifests out of this field. This has been seen through the double-slit experiment which produced the famous observer effect, which says that when the particle is not being observed, it is in a superposition, meaning it is everywhere all at once. In short, nothing is actually everything. This dimension of consciousness has been known for thousands of years in all spiritual traditions as the place where true union and experience of God takes place, But the only way to enter this field is to go beyond any thought, image, or appearance and remain in complete emptiness of mind. Just as we see from the observer effect, you cannot observe a particle and the quantum field at the same time. In the same way, you cannot observe your own thoughts about God and God Himself at the same time. And so in almost scientific fashion, the author describes this state in chapter 68. Do not try to withdraw into yourself, for to put it simply, I do not want you to be anywhere, not outside, above, behind, or beside yourself. For I would indeed have you be nowhere. Why? Because nowhere physically is everywhere spiritually. Understand this clearly. Your spiritual work is not located in any particular place, but when your mind consciously focuses on anything, you are there in that place spiritually, as certainly as your body is located in a definite place right now. Your senses and faculties will be frustrated for lack of something to dwell on, and they will chide you for doing nothing. But never mind. Go on with this nothing, moved only by your love for God. Never give up, but steadfastly persevere in this nothingness, consciously longing that you may always choose to possess God through love, whom no one can possess through knowledge. Again, this book was written in the 14th century, so needless to say, that's not the kind of knowledge someone could have gained back then by any way other than direct experience. And so, in short, whenever you meditate or contemplate on God, you must become as nothing. Or, more accurately to say, you must become no thing, no object, no thought, no self, no mind. But it's very important not to turn this into an act of effort on your part, because the mind is very quick to try and turn everything into another concept. Okay, I'm gonna become nothing now. Ready? Here I go. Did I do it? So don't try to be nothing as some sort of act of force or effort. It's very simple. Just be where nothing is. Don't associate with any thoughts that appear. It is not only not an act of effort, but it is actually a relinquishing of all effort. It's only when all effort to think or conceptualize God have been relinquished that God can be truly felt as He is. Because when you think about a thought or image of God, then you're trying to force God into a small and limited framework. And so you only can relate to that small, limited framework, but not God Himself. And this is why the mystics heavily emphasize the arts of meditation and contemplation, because as you continue in this practice, you begin to starve the thinking mind of oxygen so that the state of emptiness can be reached much quicker and easier. Your mind can only know objects, and so when you begin to meditate on nothing, just expect that your mind is going to like to try and commentate quite a bit on it, because as it turns out, the mind has a lot to say about nothing. This is so dumb. You can't just think about nothing. What's the point? Come on, what are you trying to accomplish right now? So if this voice appears during your contemplative prayer, simply ignore it. This is just what the mind does. The mind always demands that you have some sort of thought or image about God. And when you grab onto some thought or image about God, it creates an artificial barrier between you. So simply remain in that emptiness that the author describes with that naked intent towards God. The term emptiness means to remove everything out of your mind that can possibly be removed, because then you will come at last to that which alone is true and real. That which cannot be removed is, of course, God Himself. And so when Buddhism came to the West in the 19th century, Western philosophers had no idea what to make of it. Oh, Buddha said emptiness. Oh, how terrible. Therefore, we declare that Buddhism is a life-denying, atheistic, nihilistic belief structure. Western theology, especially in the 19th century, only knows doctrines, dogmas, and beliefs. And so when somebody comes along saying, in order to truly know God, you must abandon your doctrines and dogmas, the religious mind freaks out over this radical notion. But unbeknownst to them, that is precisely what the Christian mystics hundreds and hundreds of years earlier had been saying all along. Because what the Buddha meant by emptiness, Jesus called famously the fullness of life. Both Buddha and Christ spoke about the importance of denying the false self, because to be empty of self is to be full of the divine. A full glass cannot be filled. But when the state of emptiness is achieved, then God can be known intuitively and directly. And the author of The Cloud speaks about the mind's tendency to despise emptiness in the following paragraph. Who do you suppose derides it as an emptiness? Our superficial self, of course. Certainly not our true self. No, our true inner self appreciates it as a fullness beyond measure. For in this darkness, we experience an intuitive understanding of everything material and spiritual without giving special attention to anything in particular. And the last nugget of wisdom I'd like to share from this book is on a new model of prayer that the author gives us. Now, Western Christianity has long misunderstood the art of prayer to be talking to God or asking God for things you need. Ironically, no world religion seems to have misunderstood prayer more so than the 21st century Western American church, which has turned prayer into some avenue for complaining and worrying and petitioning God. The fact that this type of prayer has resulted in such a universal failure in Western Christianity proves both that the kind of God being prayed to doesn't exist, and the formula of prayer is not actually prayer at all. The fact is, God already knows everything you need even before you knew it. As Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, "And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathens do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask Him." Jesus also said in Mark, "Therefore I tell you that whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have already received it and it will be yours." And so this is either true or it isn't true. And so if what Jesus is saying here is true, then the question is, why do our prayers so often not get answered? And the answer is because we are praying from the wrong self. When you're rattling off a laundry list of wishes or complaints to God, you are praying from the ego, or as the author of the book calls it, the superficial self. But the superficial self doesn't actually exist. It's just a collection of ideas you have about yourself that are being endowed with a sense of identity, but it's not actually real. Only the true self exists, and the true self is the spirit. That is what you actually are. And when you pray from that true place, whatever you truly need is always supplied. Prayer means coming into alignment with the divine mind so that whatever you need is supplied. True prayer, as the author of The Cloud states, is directing one singular, powerful intent up to God, which surges up from the depths of your being. In chapter 37, the author writes, "Contemplatives rarely pray in words, but if they do, their words are few. The fewer, the better. As a matter of fact, yes, a word of one syllable is more suited to the spiritual nature of this work than longer ones. Let me try to illustrate what I mean with an example from real life. A man or woman terrified by sudden disaster is forced by the circumstances to the limits of his personal resource and marshals all his energy into one great cry for help. In extreme situations like this, a person is not given to many words, nor even to long ones. Instead, summoning all of his strength, he expresses his desperate need in one loud cry: help. And with this one little word, he effectively arouses the attention and assistance of others. In a similar way, we can understand the efficacy of one little interior word, not merely spoken or thought, but surging up from the depths of a man's spirit, the expression of his whole being. And so this simple prayer bursting from the depths of your spirit touches the heart of Almighty God more certainly than some long psalm mumbled mindlessly under your breath. This is the meaning of that saying in Scripture, "A short prayer pierces the heavens." And so I want to give you a new model of prayer in today's episode, and it's simply this. When you pray, go into your secret place away from all distractions and take a moment to sit down and think about where you are in your life and what it is that you truly need from God. And here's the important part. I want you to narrow it down to one single word, the root of what it is that you need. For example, if you need a new job or house, don't choose the word job or house, choose a word like abundance or prosperity. If you want to be free from a certain fear, simply choose the word freedom. Then, once you are in that place of emptiness, begin repeating that word inwardly with all of the sincerity and passion and power that you can muster. You don't need to do this for very long. Only a minute or two is needed. But the most important part is that you feel it to the depths of your being. And then spend about 5 to 10 minutes just feeling sincere gratitude towards Him for granting this request. This is, as Jesus said, believing you have already received it. Gratitude is a powerful form of belief which says that this request has already been granted. Once you see just how quickly God responds to you when you pray this way, you will crave it every single day. And in this cloud of unknowing, whatever is truly felt in that inner place of the Spirit will be answered. So in closing, I want to leave you with one last short little passage on contemplative prayer from this incredible, anonymous 14th century mystic. If you take this mindset with you into all of your contemplation and prayer, then I promise you that you will be richly rewarded as a result. See that nothing remains in your conscious mind save a naked intent stretching out toward God. Leave it stripped of every particular idea about God and keep only the simple awareness that He is as He is. Let Him be thus, I pray you, and force Him not to be otherwise. Search into Him no further, but rest in this faith as on solid ground. This awareness, stripped of ideas and deliberately bound and anchored in faith, shall leave your thought and affection in emptiness. It will feel as if your whole desire cried out to God and said, "That which I am, I offer to you, O Lord," without looking to any quality of your being, but only to the fact that you are as you are, this and nothing more. That which I am, I offer to you, O Lord, for you are it entirely.